So I have multiple questions, actually. So who do you think should take the leadership role, and what would be the first steps? And what do you think the resulting system-wide model will look like? And then also, how would data analytics play into that?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So I don't think there's any single entity that can lead this forward. I think it's got to come from lots of different communities. And the way that I look at system change in general, and then system change in this atmosphere in particular, is if you can find the thought leaders, and they're embedded all over the place. I mean, they're not all in, I wish they were all in higher administration. It might be a very different field if they were. But if you can find the thought leaders, and it's the connectors. There's a blanking on his name, and I'm blanking on the name of the book. It was a really, really big deal a couple of years ago. What is that? It basically distilled out some sociological principles and talked about how they apply in business and how to push things over the line. How do you? I can't even remember the buzzword. That's terrible. But in any case, you need connectors. The only thing that really matters in landscapes in the end are the networks that we form.
Right.
And there are certain linchpin people who, regardless of where they may be positioned, have really strong voices that carry. And so part of it is finding and empowering those people. And then the other part of it is having something that is neutral enough at the center that provides some glue and some backbone. And that can be a diverse backbone. I mean, it doesn't have to be one organization. It can be a number of organizations that come together and agree on, we're going to play this neutral role and just help to network everybody else together. That group has to have no vested stake. It can't want one thing or the other as the outcome. It has to be willing to play according to the players. And I think we've got some examples of things like that. I think NISO does a good bit of that in the U.S. context. I think that there are other organizations as well, and it's certainly the model that Educopia is trying to put forward. In a very small way, this would be a much bigger thing.
In your presentation, you mentioned a project, Project Meerkat. Is that an attempt to do what you're talking about?
A little bit. It's an attempt to do one piece of it, and I think there are going to have to be a lot of initiatives that line up and try to do this in different spaces. What Meerkat would do, so we're talking about, and this is just in the vetting period, so this is not even a full-fledged proposal yet. It is an outline and an idea. But what it would aim to do is three main things. It would aim to set up a cooperative structure that might be an organization, it might not. I'm not sure how to describe it without having all of the stakeholders at the table defining it, but something that is glue and that's governance, that holds the community of stakeholders together, including the publishers, the libraries, the aggregators, the analysts, the authors. I mean, there are so many different players that need to be represented in this mix, and something that neutralizes that enough so that we can trust each other. You have to have an environment that cultivates trust and then reinforces it, right? And so that cooperative infrastructure is a big piece of the project. Like, how do we set that up? How do we empower voices to make decisions, and how does that get governed, and how do we make it as transparent as it needs to be, et cetera? So that's one piece of it.
That's another
transparency is so
exactly,
huge.
Because you can't build trust without transparency.
Nope, you sure can't. And so if we can do that piece at the same time as we're also building a model for usage data, so, and starting with one piece of the scholarly enterprise, monographs, which are understudied. A lot of the analytics that are done right now are not done on that piece. Counter's starting to do some. I mean, there are some programs and some projects that are starting to approach that issue, but nobody's invested a lot in it, in part because there's not money in the market, right? So it's not, the journals are where most of this is happening. But monographs are really interesting because nobody has a large control of the market. There's no big player. It looks like a donut when you look at monograph publishing, because you've got so many publishers and they all have like 3% or less. There's nobody with like 15% of the market, which means that all of them can be incentivized to work together in order to understand where usage data is aggregated. They all need each other, in essence, in order to understand the whole, and you can't understand your own impact unless you can measure that against the whole. So a piece of this would be that kind of usage model and usage data model for both gathering the data, so where can we get this from, where, what does it mean, how do we modify, how do we map it together so that it makes sense? Those are like dense questions. It's hard, but we do hard things all the time. I mean, it's not impossible, it's just hard. And then the third piece, and the most crucial, and it's the heart of that project, is a code of ethics. And I don't use that term lightly. I think that data ethics are a very, very big issue, and we are completely ignoring it right now. There are small projects, again, and small groups that are talking about this, and are talking about the implications of the use of data for scholarly inquiry, but it's happening in small pockets in lots of different places, and those groups are competing instead of aligning, and that's dangerous, so that you're going to wind up with like 10 principled statements out there that may all be great, but nobody's going to follow them because they haven't decided it together. You've got to bring the whole community together to do that. And so working out some of those initial questions around what gets gathered, what gets shared, how that gets shared, how much PII is there, how much of the personally identifying information is there, and how much do we need to let other people know what that PII is and how it's being used. So one of the other problems here is that for the users, both the readers and the authors, they're not even aware of how much of their activity is already being captured.
Correct.
And that's a problem. They need to be aware. We're not going to stop the tide. I mean, there was a talk about this that I got to see a piece of before I came over here. We're not going to be able to stop the data flow that is already in existence at this point. We can change people's awareness of what it is, and we can change the ways in which it is used if we're willing to think about it and actually look at it, instead of just, oh, well, I need to catalog today. I'm a metadata librarian. That's not my problem. And that's where getting to the field level and starting to understand how much this is going to impact everything we're doing is necessary. And this is one very small project idea. It's we're talking about seed funding it from the community at $5,000 or $1,000 a piece, so that there are some low barriers to entry for almost any player, and have some other ways to bring people in advisory roles, so that if they can't afford to be there but need to be there, they're still there, and do it as a seed-funded 3-year initiative that costs less than $500,000. And then once you've got that nexus together, that's powerful. And the other thing that should be a motivator for those who come to this table is that there are going to be R&D dollars that can come out of this, because all of the funders are going to want to get behind this if they see that the community's actually coming together. They're actually grappling with it. Okay, now we know, let's come in and fund this piece over here where the publishers are working on this piece, and maybe the aggregators are working on this piece, and we know all of those investments are actually going to achieve something, because instead of competing, they're aligning, and the investment at the end of the day multiplies. I mean, it basically makes it worth so much more than if you've got a few pennies over here, or a lot of pennies over here, and a lot of pennies over here that go in different directions, and there's no way for it to fuse and actually take hold.
Well, I think new ways of funding are going to be critical.
Imperative.
And concerns about privacy, as you mentioned earlier, it's huge. It can be pretty shocking as to how exposed so many people are.
Yeah, all of us are.
So can you predict how this is going to end?
No.
Or no?
No.
Or are you? I was going to say,
that's the fun of it, right? I mean, who knows?
I'm sitting here thinking and listening to everything that you're saying, and it sounds like it's all worthwhile and it's doable, but it sounds so time-consuming, which is fine. Except I'm wondering, do we have enough time?
Yeah.
That's my concern.
I think we can't not have enough time. I think that the issue is so important that if we don't take the time, and we don't, I mean, nobody's got the time for anything. We're all working, the equivalent of about 4 jobs in one, because of the way that the resource, the recession was not a pleasant thing to be going through over the last decade. And so everybody feels like they're already stretched to the nth degree. But again, if we can't get out of that individualized and institutionalized perspective and look at this from a field lens, then that's not going to get better. better. And if we do look at it from that level, then we can actually shape where we're going. And at that point, there is a way out someday. And the key here is going to be figuring out how to get that message across in a way that doesn't just hit for a few minutes like it might have this morning, or like it might when people are watching this, but it actually resonates and then gets backed up by action. And that's the moving from, kind of talk about something to actual action. And it happens.
That was actually part of my other question that I didn't really get to say when I was asking you about leadership. Like, what are the first steps? Like, how do we get the momentum going?
Right.
Like, how do we do the actions?
Right. And I think, the first thing is building the community. So if we can pull together people, and again, I think this happens in multiple arenas at the same time. And I think that the societies and the associations that are already leaders and kind of bridge points for large portions of the field, I think that they're linchpins in this. I think that they don't talk to each other, which is theater of the absurd. Like they've thought of each other as competitors for too long, or as just not relevant. And if they can start to understand the relevance that they have to each other, and I think that's already starting to take place. We see lots of cross-sector explorations going on, and it's a matter of reaching that next level. And I think the only way to do that is to beat the drum a bit. And that's what we're trying to do with the publishing analytics data trust.
Right.
That's really the end goal of Project Meerkat, is catalyzing some activity and really trying to bridge players.
Building those bridges.
Because those relationships are what's going to change the system.
Okay.
Yeah.